Hello guys, and welcome to this tutorial where I'll be taking this raw image and taking it from this into this. So let's go ahead and see how we can work with raw images in Affinity Photo and see what advantages it has. So first things first, let's open up Affinity Photo 2. And while that's loading up, we'll just take the opportunity to discuss about what raw files are. So raw files are basically the data that gets captured by your camera and contains additional information about lighting, color. It doesn't compress anything. So let's go ahead and import this. And also DNG files are a modern, let's say they are modern raw files because they contain metadata information about the lens, when the image was taken, the location, and also some data that's relevant to pictures. So now that we've understood the difference between raw files that are different for each specific camera, DNG files are much more recent because they also hold metadata. So we can just think about DNG files as advanced raw files. Now there are some apps you can use on your device and allow you to capture raw files, but just know that if you use any modern phone, you can actually capture your raw files. The only setback is they are much more larger. If you're not someone who's really into photography, you'll just be doing well with your PNG or JPEG files. So first thing we want to do is to go to File and open up the image. Now we can create a new project, but we don't know the image size yet. So I'm just going to go to Open and navigate to a folder where I have my raw files. So I have this called raw, and I think it's raw 2, and in raw 2 on the media, I'm just going to go to my images folder and just bring in any image I find interesting. Now, I kind of like this one. Let me just pick this one or something that has a little bit of lighting information. I think this one has some light information, and you can see these are DNG files taken at very high resolution, and each picture is about this is about 17 megabytes and this one is about 16 megabytes. So usually if there are JPEG files, you'll actually notice the JPEG files are smaller. This is my daughter trying to forcefully open my door. I think I like this one. Alright, so well, we can just bring in both of these actually. So one with some lighting information like this one, some light information, and this one. So I'll just select these two and click open. And this is going to bring in the image files. Now, when it does bring in these files, you're not ready to start editing yet because you need to jump into the develop persona. So sometimes if it recognizes that it's a DNG file, what it's going to do is to just go up to this persona. So we're actually on the develop persona. If you click on this develop, you're going to go back to the main Affinity Designer persona. So now we have this image here. It's a raw image that contains a lot of information. Now, if you want this to be the same as mine, so we just go to Window or Range and then go to Studio, and then go to Reset Studio. So everything is just docked on the right side. But I usually like having the navigator tiered out like that, and I'll just place that over here. And I also like having my panels tiered out. So this is our image, and you can see at the top here, if I click on, because I brought two of these, all right, so if I click on this one, it's actually telling me the size, and here's the size, and then it's also showing me some settings for the camera, including the shutter speed, the f-stop, and the ISO. So we can kind of like zoom in and see that. So it's actually storing a lot of that information. Very lovely lovely image. So let's see what we can do here. So the first thing we want to do is remember to click on your develop persona, and over here you actually see we have a histogram. You can change this to scope and we can bounce to the metadata. Now that's why I said the DNG files are much more recent because it can tell you a lot. So it's telling me the phone I'm using is the iPhone 12 Pro Max, the maker is Apple, and the lens. So I'm using the back camera, and that's the 5.1 mm at the f-stop of 1.6, and it also tells me the date, the size of the image, the ISO, and it's on auto exposure and pattern. I don't think this auto exposure is true because I manually set the exposure. So let's go back to the scope. So the scope is going to tell you where, if you have too much light or underdeveloped sections, I think this is actually good because we can see there's no burnout anywhere at all. There's no much lighting that's really burning through this image. So I think it's really a nice one, right? So let's go over here to the basic setup here. So first we can adjust the exposure. So I'll just go ahead and just drag this, and this is going to just be now when you're dragging the exposure, look what happens. If I drag this all the way to black, look at what's happening in my histogram, right? It's just crushing everything and telling me there's not much lighting information. If I drag this towards white, it's burning everything out. So just want to go for a nice little exposure like that. So like so, I think this is just fine. And we can always look at the navigator to see what's happening over there. So let's go to the black point and just drag this over here, because I want this focus to be around this section. So if I play around with the black point, it's going to kind of like darken this section here, but I don't want it to be too much. So I'll just slide that back up here. So let's head over to the brightness as well. So for the brightness, I'll just drag this down. See, that's too bright. I'll just drag this over here and just pull this, let's say just 4, like that. And then we can see our enhance section. We can play around with the contrast. We're just going to push out the darks and then work with the dark layers and then bright layers. So I'll just push this gradually here, and then I'll just push a little bit of clarity like that. And this is where you can really go crazy and begin to like make the image how you want the image to really look like, right? So this is where we're doing that. And then for the saturation, now you might want to leave your saturation and then use other effects in Affinity to add some of the color if you want. But for here, I'll just drag that up a little bit so we can see that's down. That's like black and white, and we'll just drag this and push this up. Now you can see more of that sky detail, that blue sky. So I'll leave that at 14. And then for the vibrance, just push this up just a little bit so we can have a beautiful, nice, contrasty cloud color. Now for this tab, we can do a lot of things here. We can do things like play around with our white balance and set the temperature like so to make this slightly warmer and give it some kind of like golden glow. So I'll just make this slightly warm, not too much, and I'll just leave it there. And we can also work on the shadows and highlights. So again, we have tools that work specifically for some specific things. For instance, if I push this here, we're much in the shadow, but if I want to see more of those buildings, you just see them over here. So my focus is going to be on the sky, so I'll just drag that here. And then for the highlights, we just set this to anyone we want. So let's go to the lens. Now this is going to distort the lens. I don't want to do that, right? But if you want, you could just apply a little bit of distortion on the lens just to push things and kind of like make them more in your face kind of. So you can actually see how that's warped and it's giving it this kind of nice little motion. I think I like that, but I don't want to overdo it, right? So let's just push this. This is 0, so let's try about, I think 13 is good. So I'm just apply a little bit of distortion on this. And we can try out some things here, like remove vignette and other things. Here we can apply a noise reduction, and we can just push this, and this is going to really soften the image. And you might not really see that, but if we have more, let's just push everything to 100% like that. It's going to take a little while to load up into memory, but this is going to make sure you have a very smooth and crispy image. I don't really push it up to 100, so something about that is super okay. It's actually a nice image, very low ISO as we've seen from the metadata, so it's not really going to have much noise, but in case you have much noise, you can always work on that. And for the detail refinement, we can also turn this on, and if you have a noisy image, you can set up this and kind of like tweak that. So here, if I dial that, we can see it's affecting some areas, especially if I push that radius up, you can actually see that detail refinement over there. So in case you're happy with this and you actually see how that looks like, then we can hit develop. And what this is going to do is to convert this back to a format that we can use in Affinity Designer. The first thing I'll do is hit Ctrl J. to duplicate that, and I'll just either turn this off or lock this so that I'll work on the layer that's actually above. I'll just drag my navigator over here like so. Just minimize this back. So what we can do now is begin to add a few effects. Now the first thing is I'll go over here to the mask layer and right click, and I'll try a hue range mask and just apply that here. And what I'll do is to separate that, so I can right click and say release mask like so, and I'll just drag this, place it over here, and what we can do is just play around with these values to make these changes. Alright, so now that we have our image, let's just begin editing it. So the first thing I want to do is just take a look and see how I can improve this. Now I like how this is nice, but overall the image is looking slightly dark. So let's first look at some tools we can use. So first I'm going to use a mask to select some shadows, highlights and midtones so I can work with each one separately. So let's do that. So I'll go over here and right click on the mask layer, and I'll click on the luminosity range mask, and let's take advantage of some of the built-in tools it has. So here I'll just click on the drop down arrow and start with the shadows, and basically what it's doing is selecting everything it thinks is, you know, not a shadow. So of course the cloud is not a shadow, and we can actually see all these objects in the foregrounds are slightly darker, and it's actually selecting those as the shadows, which is actually nice. So what I'll do is just drag the radius a little bit, and we can play around with these points like so, just a little bit, and I'll uncheck linear so we can make this have a slightly nice curve. We can add a point here if we want. Alright, I think that's super nice. So selecting everything you think that's not shadow, that's the cloud and everything, so it's going to protect them. What that means is if I want to add shadows to these guys, I can do that while I'm protecting the sky that doesn't really have much shadows. Makes sense. So first what I'll do is to just separate this, because if here you can actually see it's here. So I'll just right click that and release this mask. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to add this and our image in a group so I can edit them separately. And I believe we've separated that already, so we can see that like that. So I'll just close this and I'll just hit Ctrl G to create a group, and I'll call that SHD for shadows. And I don't have that shadow. Let's create a nice little adjustment layer that can play around with colors. Let's use the hue, saturation and lightness. So HSL, and we can put the HSL in this group. So I'll just drag this and place this here. So yeah, so let's try this. So if we're shifting the hue, you can see it's only affecting the shadow areas. So we had some shadow here at the top and some shadow at the bottom. So it's changing only the colors. So we can have a weird sky color like that if we want. And we can do things like desaturate just that section. So you can see how it's really pushing that. And we can even make this super dark if we want, just to create a lot of effects. And you can see how we can just play around with this like so. Alright, so it really depends on what you want to do. We can make this very saturated, and we can just desaturate that a little bit like so. We can, now this is for the general one, we can select the color range for each. Let's see, for the reds, And then here we can just adopt and make those super changes. That. So that's for the shadows. We can repeat the same process again for the midtones so that we can have something interesting. And also remember, we can always reduce the intensity. Now this is the before and this is the after. I think I nuked it, so I'll just go ahead and just drag this down a bit so we don't have much of that. Like so. So let's do the same for our midtones. Remember, let's go over here. So this time around, let's go ahead and get back to our original image. I'll just click on that and let's right click and go to our luminosity range mask. And this time around, I want to click on the highlights, and basically we can see what it's actually doing there. So we can get rid of linear and try to reset this to work on it so we can capture more range like that. So here it's looking at the bright sections on the image and looking at the highlights. I'll just blur this a little bit like so. So I think that's fine. So what we'll do is to release this mask. And once we've released that, we can create a group and add this to a group. So I'll just hit Ctrl G and I'll just call that highlight, or short form for highlight. And we can do the same thing we actually did here. So let's create a HSL adjustment layer. Let's look for our hue, saturation, lightness, and we can just pass that into the highlights group. And now when we play around with our highlights, we can actually see that it's just affecting those areas that it has selected and seeing that those are areas that have a little bit of light. So you can see how we can improve that by either making this a little bit brighter like that, so, and then pushing these colors to give it some very nice interesting color. We can do a lot here. We can make it golden. We can, yeah, just like that. So again, it depends on what you're trying to create. So here, I just want it to be kind of like super bright like that. So I'll just pump up that saturation a bit. And for the luminosity, I can just drag this down a bit. Just see that. All right, so we can see we have this nice interesting thing going on. If we actually look at the navigator a bit, you can see how that is. And remember, this is 100%. So what we can do is to just go over here to our highlight and then just dial that down a bit so it's not really crazy. So this is 100%. This is about 50%, just half of that, and I think that's also good. So we've done that for the highlights. Let's select it again and try doing that for our midtones. So let's click the luminosity range mask and let's try that for the midtones. Now the midtones is quite similar to the shadows. So if you want to apply this, that's totally fine, but I don't think there's a need for that because I already have that. So with that selected, I'll just delete this. And if I really want to edit the shadows, this is where I should go. Right, because I have my shadow layer here, so I can just go in there and click on my HSL, and we can just drag that either down or up. So I'll just drag this down a bit to make it slightly dark, and that's it. So, and then finally I can add an overall effect on the entire thing, and to do that I'm just going to go to the top here, and here under adjustments I'll try the curves. I really like the opportunity to kind of like select each of these and place points. Make sure I can see this and see what I'm doing here, and I can just dial this down a bit and then push this slightly up like that. You can see what that's doing, and we can add one at the center here. and then trying to bring back some of that detail here. So I'm trying to create like a nice vignette, just a little bit of vignette, nothing too serious. So, and the curves is in here. I want it to be on top and overall. That's why I was having a super weird effect there. So you can see the curves is basically, we're using that to do some sort of lighting. Again, it's too strong for 100%. So what we can do, we can go back to our curves adjustment and try to bring back down some of this. And at the center as well, just trying to push that down so we can have more focus on that cloud. And here, like that. I think this is good. So what we can do now is to just turn this off and see. And let's dial this down to about, so this is 0%, this is about, I think 50 or 60% is kind of good. So if you look at this, we have a nice little picture. We've set our focus around this region. We've added a nice little lens distortion to this image, and I think I'll leave it here. So let's let's group everything. So I'll select all these, hit Ctrl G to group them, and I'll just call that Sky Edit. Now again, we can do a lot. We can blur our mask and blur regions, but that's going to be too much for this. And looking at this, I like to look at this section here. We have some of that blue, so it's just over here, right? You just see how that makes it look unique and different. And I'm just getting rid of this one. So if we look at this, our focus is around here, and we've achieved what we want to achieve. So this is the before, and this is the after. Right? This is before, and this is after. Subtle effects, nothing too much. And we can see how we can really make those changes. So that's one advantage of working with the HDR. And when you're done, we can export this. I'm going to go to File and go to Export, and I can export this as a PNG. The PNG is going to retain most of the details, so it's also going to be a heavy file. So it's best to export as a PNG if you want to retain quality, but if you're exporting for the web, you can use JPEG and then pin that output using JPEG. So yeah, so this is about 46 megabytes. It's quite large, and I really love it to be, you know, that large, because it just means it's holding a lot of our quality. If we try JPEG, it's going to compress. This PNG doesn't really compress. And looking at this, we can even just add a nice little levels layer. And what this does is to push in some of those blacks like that. In case you're not happy with that, you can try some gamma just to have a bit more contrast. So I like it like that. So I'll just go ahead and dial this down so we can get just about 50% of that effect, not 100%. So here I'm going to go to File, Export, and we'll export as PNG again. So it's going to estimate the file size and export this. So basically that's how you can work with raw files when you're using Affinity Photo. And this is just for an environment background. If you're working with, say, a person, you can do things like, you know, change the fabric. And I think I should do that. So in my next tutorial, I'm going to be using this same concept, but working on a portrait, because there are more tools we can take advantage of. So I'll just hit Export, and I'll just call that Sky Final, and I'll just hit Save to export that image. So see you guys in the next tutorial.